to say, here we go, the recording's on, to say a big thank you to Hannah Pennock, who I can see is on our conference this afternoon. So behind the scenes, the team who organise these conferences has, since we started, been led in the most incredible way by Hannah, who is now retiring both from her role within the Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency, but also she's decided to retire from her role in keeping us, the steering group, in order and doing all the right things. So I'm sure you will all join me in thanking Hannah for all her work over a good many years, which has facilitated, encouraged, and brought the steering group to enable you to receive and enjoy the conferences that we're putting on. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to Hannah. Well, really appreciate that. So, our conference today is, as you're aware, focusing on water pumping mills, an opportunity not only to explore our craft in different countries, but in this conference to focus on a particular type of mill and function. And over the coming months, we will be hosting other conferences focusing on other types of mill where we find those mills in different countries. And we're delighted to be able to bring to you today presentations from colleagues in the Netherlands. We're going to be hearing from Tom Kreuning a little shortly. We're going to be going then to the UK, where Andrew Tulett will be exploring the UK's heritage of pumping mills. And then we're going to go across the pond, a bit of a big pond to drain, perhaps, and we're going to hear from Lindsay Baker and Christopher Giles, who will tell us some really great information and understanding about water pumping mills in the US. So a rich array awaits us. As ever, if we can just talk about some housekeeping for our conference, please keep your microphones on mute whilst you're listening to the presentations. We will have time for questions after each presentation, and I'm pleased to say that our presenters are all going to be or are already on our conference, so they will be able to answer questions. So if you can now put your microphones onto mute, please. You're most welcome to use the chat for questions. So please add any questions during the presentations if you would like, and we'll be reviewing the questions. I'm very grateful that behind the scenes, Jippe Kreuning is doing the technical work today. So he's going to be capturing questions along with myself, and we'll have a chance to work through those after the presentations. So, we're going to, as I say, first of all, visit the Netherlands, and I'm pleased to introduce um, Tom Kreuning. Tom has been a miller since 1993. He's an executive member of the Guild of Millers. He has been their secretary and indeed vice president. He's also a volunteer at the National Mills Archive. He is also a miller, as I say, and he lives at the Strijkmolen D in Alkmaar, Strijkmolen. I think I get that pronunciation right. So, what better person to be introducing our Dutch pumping mill heritage? Tom is also a member of the steering group of the Craft of the Miller Network, a retired medical doctor, and a keen gardener as well. He's actually also, by the way, father of Jippe, who is doing the technical work. So, well and truly a great person to know and a key member of our steering group and network. So, let's hand over to Tom. And once we've heard from Tom, we've got a short video from Hollandsche Molen exploring more of the history of poldermolen from the Netherlands. So we're going to look at two videos and then we'll break for some questions. So Jippe, could you invite Tom onto our screens, please?
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kreuning and I've been passionate about windmills since my earliest childhood. In the photo, you can see me carrying a little windmill because in Dutch, walking with windmills means you're a bit crazy. Later in life, alongside my medical studies and work as a medical doctor, I became a miller through the Guild of Millers. From 2013 to 2025, I served on the Guild's executive board. Now I'm a member of the International Steering Committee organizing these conferences. Today, I'll give you a brief overview of the history of water management and milling in the Netherlands. At the end, we'll show a short film to further clarify everything. By the way, I've lived in this mill in Alkmaar for 24 years now. And for your information, in Dutch, a polder is a reclaimed land area, and the verb to polder means working together while everyone agrees, as it was the only way to keep our feet dry. The Netherlands lies about 1/3 below sea level. This wasn't always the case, and there are several reasons for it. The land has always been low-lying and prone to flooding. Early inhabitants lived on the slightly higher sand ridges parallel to the coast, where the first settlements emerged. By the end of the 10th century, modest settlements had appeared in the peatlands, habitable land without dikes. The wilderness around these settlements was reclaimed. Excess water could still drain naturally into the sea. However, drainage caused the ground to subside, a phenomenon known as klink. Additionally, the upper peat layer oxidized as it dried. The deeper the peat was drained, the more it subsided. There was also a rise in sea level. Water nuisance increased and measures had to be taken. The monks of Egmond Abbey were probably the first to build internal dikes to protect their lands from flooding. This started at the end of the 10th century. As the external water level rose and the reclaimed peatland subsided, it became harder to discharge excess water naturally. People first turned to hand, tread, and horse-powered watermills, and later to small windmills. In 1407-1408, William VI, Count of Holland, ordered some of his advisors to investigate a mill in Alkmaar, that's where I live now, that was pumping out water. They traveled from The Hague to Alkmaar to investigate how Floris van Alkemade and Jan Grietensoen were using a mill to discharge water. This was considered very important in The Hague, though the exact method of pumping was not recorded. Unfortunately, there are also no images of the 15th century mills. Later, quays were built and simple sluices and closable culverts allowed water to be discharged into the water outside the polder, only when the external water level permitted. The establishment of polders created artificial control over water levels. A difference arose between the external and internal water levels, or between the boezem, the buffer, and polderwater. Small polders were merged into larger ones, each with its own administration. The focus shifted from individual measures against water nuisance to collective solutions. Peat extraction also created large, connected bodies of water. Cities, in particular, lacked sufficient firewood, and peat was the only alternative. During the 15th century, wind-powered drainage became more common. The invention of wind-powered drainage must have been a major event. The capacity of wind-powered watermill, however modest at first, would have exceeded that of the hand, tread, or horse-powered mills already. A note in the Count's accounts for the years 1406-1408 supports this. In the early 17th century, large lakes were drained. These were major projects, often financed by wealthy merchants. Sometimes more than 50 mills were needed to drain a lake in just a few years. After the lake was drained, the merchants grew even richer by selling the reclaimed land, and the pumping continued because of constant water coming in from above and from below. Meanwhile, the mills had grown into impressive giants equipped with large scoop wheels. A scoop wheel could lift water about 1 meter. Since the lakes were about 4 meters deep, a series of 3 or 4 mills was needed to pump a lake dry. From 1630 onward, the Archimedean screw was gradually introduced. Its advantage was that it could lift water higher. An important figure of that time was Jan Adriaanszoon Leegwater. He was not the executor of these large projects, but was often asked for advice. As an independent, he actually was the first hydraulic consultant in the Netherlands. Each drained lake became a polder with its own administration for water management. Through mergers, these administrations formed water boards, which still exist today. In North Holland, that's where I live, there is a large water board responsible for water and dike management. This board also owns 19 working windmills that can be deployed in emergencies like excess rainfall due to climate change, power failures, etc., to pump away water completely climate neutral. In total, there are 59 mills in the province of North Holland that are operational and can drain the land. All these mills have millers who are more than happy to step in when needed, just as they did 400 years ago. And now we're going to watch a little film.
A significant portion of the Netherlands lies below sea level, and without its dunes and dikes, it would certainly flood during high tides or elevated river levels. The area of the Netherlands that lies lower than 1 meter above normal Amsterdam level is what we call Low Netherlands, and that is a very large region.
The Low Countries were once a peat bog. The peat soil was waterlogged like a wet sponge. If you want to build a house or sow crops on that peat soil, you'd first need to dry it out. People did this by draining the water through ditches. But as soon as you dry out peat soil, it subsides and the land sinks lower and lower.
And so the peat soil subsides because people want to live and work upon it. This gradual sinking of the ground is what we call subsidence. The soil begins to sink as soon as you drain the water from it. It might only be a few centimeters per year, but over approximately 400 years, that quickly adds up to 4 to 6 meters.
By the year 1400, the peat soil had sunk so much everywhere that the area was increasingly flooding. The water no longer drained away naturally from the polders. Therefore, the people had to come up with a different solution. They realized that the water from the polder needed to be scooped upwards.
Fortunately, people came up with the idea to use the windmill as a water pump, and that's how the first polder mill was constructed.
The first polder windmills operated using a scoop wheel. This wheel is essentially a type of wheel that rotates by the power of the mill's sails. It extends a small portion into the water, which is channeled from the ditch directly to the mill. The scoop wheel is equipped with wooden planks that continuously scoop the water out. A small scoop wheel cannot lift the water as high as a large scoop wheel, but in the meantime the land kept sinking further and further. The polder mills therefore became larger and larger because they had to drain ever deeper water.
However, the scoop wheel could not reach any deeper than 1.5 meters. To be able to go deeper, around 1630, the scoop wheel was replaced by the Archimedes screw. Here you can see such a screw. An Archimedes screw is a type of spiral that is driven by the mill and brings the water from bottom to top. It can lift the water up to about 3 to 4 meters high, so that is 1 meter higher than the...
But the scoop wheel or screw pump. Often, polders were simply too deep to be drained by a single mill alone, so they created a staircase of several mills, each passing the water to the next. The bottom mill drains the water from the polder ditches into the first intermediate basin. The middle mill pumps the water up to the next intermediate basin. The last mill in the row, the upper mill, pumps the water out of the final basin permanently out of the polder. The pumping of water away in stages using a series of windmills is known as stepped drainage. You can still see these mill systems today, sometimes even in operation.
Due to the step dewatering process, all the lakes could be pumped completely dry. And that's exactly what happened extensively from the 17th century. These polders, such as the Beemster and the Schermer, provided a great deal of new land, but they also offered significant protection against the turbulent waters of the wild lakes. During storms, the waves would violently tear away the land from the riverbanks. It was as if the water itself was actively devouring the land. This destructive process they named the water wolf.
The polder windmills were thus the primary weapon in the battle against the dangerous water wolf, and there seemed to be no end to their collective power. Or was there? The Haarlemmermeer was so incredibly vast that it was believed it would take many centuries before it could ever be successfully drained. It was only with the groundbreaking invention of steam pumping stations, which possessed significantly more power and efficiency than traditional windmills, that even this largest and most notoriously dangerous lake could finally be reclaimed. Ultimately, 3 powerful steam pumping stations were employed to pump out the water from the Haarlemmermeer, a monumental task that spanned 4 years.
This has been the story of the polder windmills. Would you like to visit one yourself? Then check our website.
Well, thank you very much to Tom. And the video that we showed secondly is available on the Hollandse Molen website. As one of the commentators in our group was just enjoying the different accents. You know, it's great that we are able to access AI translations, which do a pretty good job. Apologies that sometimes the speaker speaks very quickly in order to keep up with the video, but it certainly means that many more of us can appreciate some of the different languages. And if, by the way, you would like us to translate further, then this is a possibility and we would be grateful for any feedback. But let's now invite some questions. Tom is with us. And so do we have some questions for Tom? If you'd like to raise your hand, and I'll invite you in and we can hear your question and ask Tom to answer.
So I guess it was all very clear.
It certainly sounds as though it was, Tom. Anything that Tom can help with? I did happen to notice if you were looking at Tom's video feed, I think well, it's still, you can see now, his mill is actually turning
Yes.
while he is speaking to us right now. You can see the shadow moving forward. I can see a question from Elisa. Elisa, would you like to unmic and come on in, please?
Thank you. Tom, I wonder if you might be able to share a little more about the famous UNESCO World Heritage Site of Kinderdijk and the role that it plays in interpreting the water pumping heritage of the Netherlands today.
Okay, yeah, the mills on the Kinderdijk, there are about 19, I think. They are on the UNESCO World Heritage List because they have a special system also from pumping the water from the one level to the other level. So it's actually, I think it's only two different levels, but it was lots of water, so they needed lots of mills. But they are from the not from the 17th century. They are a bit later. They're from the 18th century, I think they are. Yeah, and the here in North Holland we had the Schermerpolder, which was pumped dry with 50 something mills, and they were up and running until 1929. So we actually had more mills here than at the Kinderdijk. And at that time, people came from Amsterdam, tourists came already to see these mills. Unfortunately, they got unemployed and most of them were taken down. So otherwise, we would have the Kinderdijk here around the corner in the North Holland. Yeah.
And I'm noticing, Tom, there that you are saying that the mills were still working, draining in the late 1920s.
Yes, and my
And you
mill.
also said in your presentation that when necessary, millers are called in to maintain water levels or to help in addition to the diesel and electrical pumps, which are now situated on the polders.
Yeah, still today. Sometimes, well, my mill can't pump any. It can only turn the sails. But many mills, as I told in my presentation, can do the job, and millers get sometimes called in to help. Yeah, that's a proud moment for a miller.
So the technology is far from redundant and actually still making a very meaningful and critical contribution to the safety of hundreds and thousands of residents of the Netherlands.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So that's, I think, always a very powerful thing for us to remember if we see the Netherlands having a significant amount of rain. But I guess it's not only the Netherlands, is it? Because you happen to have a number of large rivers which are
Mhm.
discharging water from the rest of Europe through the Netherlands. So what
Yeah.
Germany and other countries store up for you, you can get delivered.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Tom? It's easy to think that the Netherlands have, the greatest heritage of pumping mills. Maybe we will find more out as we go through our conference. But any more questions for Tom?
Tom, are there still paid millers at Arlanderveen? And then I think we have a question in the chat.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there is one polder who actually has no electrical pump or steam pump, or there's only uh, they keep this polder dry through four windmills. That's Arlanderveen, and these millers are paid by the board of this polder. So they have to do the job sometimes day and night to keep the land dry. Yeah, and it's still
Mm.
going on.
Thank you, Tom. I can see, yes, thank you, Alyssa. A question from Anthony Constable. Anthony, would you like to come on in? We can see your question there, but if you'd like to say more about that, we'd be very grateful.
Yeah, I was just wondering if when the mill went down for repairs, I would assume they'd have to take all the mills running that piece because the water would accumulate at one level at that point of the failed mill. And would they usually schedule mills in the series all within one time period to maintain all of them at one point?
Unfortunately, Anthony, your voice is not coming across very clearly, but I think if I understand it, building on your question. So, what happens, Tom, if one mill in a series of mills breaks down? How is the work able to continue? Could you tell us more about that, please?
Yes, yeah. Nowadays they have also mobile pumps and emergency pumps that can do it. But in the old days, when they had to pump dry a polder and say one of the mills was struck by lightning and burned down, then they had a complete mill in stock because it's just like yeah, all the parts were there, so they could do in a couple of months they could build a new mill and get it running again. So there was always one mill in stock, full, all the parts, sales, access, and everything. Yeah.
That's
Thank you.
thank you, Anthony, for your question. That's a fascinating fact, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
and a serious issue if the protection were to be breached for any length of time.
Yeah.
Well, thank you once again to Tom for introducing the huge heritage and huge importance that pumping mills are to the Netherlands. And that's given us a really fascinating start to our conference and discussion. Well, let's now come across the North Sea. The North Sea not only challenging the Netherlands, but also challenging the UK. And we're going to now hear from Dr. Andrew Tulett. Andrew's been involved with drainage mills on the Norfolk Broads, in particular through a previous role that he had working with Norfolk County Council and the Norfolk Windmills Trust. Now, Andrew has since moved on to a different role within Norfolk County Council, but he's maintained a very significant interest in pumping mills, and we're delighted to welcome him to tell us more about the history and development of pumping mills in the UK and the current situation as regards their repair. So, just to be clear, Andrew is speaking today in his private capacity, not as a representative of Norfolk County Council. He's with us on our conference, and so again, once we've heard from Andrew, he'll be there to answer some questions. So, Jeppe, can you do the necessary, please?
Okay, hello, my name's Andrew, and this presentation is about the heritage of drainage mills in the UK. I've worked on a few projects involving mills since 2019, usually mills owned by Norfolk County Council, which are managed by Norfolk Windmills Trust. But I changed jobs in November last year, so today I have to point out I'm speaking entirely in my own capacity. So it's good to get that out of the way. Unlike windmills that produce flour, drainage mills are really associated with only two areas within the UK, and both of those are in the east of England. The first of these is the Fens, which are marked with the number 1 on this map, and the other is the Broads, which are marked with the number 2. They're both very low-lying areas of land. In fact, these maps were prepared to show areas that were liable to flooding, so some of the red areas extended to bits that aren't really in the Fens of the Broads, but the map will do for our purposes. And I'm going to deal with the Fens first. If you live in the UK, or if you're thinking about making a special trip to the east of England to look at drainage mills, don't go to the Fens, don't go to number 1, go to number 2, go to the Broads, because if you go to the Fens, it will be a very short trip because there's only one drainage mill left. And it's this one. This is Wicken Drainage Mill, originally called Norman's Mill because it was built in 1907 for Mr. Norman. It also stood a mile further south than it now does. It stopped working in the 1930s and it was recognised as being the last drainage mill left in the Fens. So it was taken apart, moved to another location and restored. And that's recorded in this newspaper article from 1956. And although the article celebrates the restoration, it also recognises that little more than the iron parts of the wheels and gears remain from the original mill, and that some of the timbers which had resisted the dampness of the Fens over the years were still there. But the mill was restored to full working order. You can see from the semicircular hoodway at the base of the mill that Wicken Drainage Fen runs a scoop wheel. The weatherboarding on the mill was added in 1910, so after it was built, which gives it the appearance of being a smock mill. It's now owned by the National Trust, so you can go and visit it on Wicken Fen Nature Reserve. But it is now, like I say, the last drainage mill in the Fens, which is remarkable when you consider that drainage mills have been a feature of the Fens landscape for almost 400 years, from the 1550s and right up until the 1930s. And it's likely that in the past there would have been many hundreds of this type of mill located across the Fens. They're estimated to be around 1,500 sites in the Fens associated with mills, drainage mills. Some of those with mills that were restored, altered, built or replaced over time. Wicken Drainage Mill is a survivor, but perhaps not representative of all the mills that there used to be in the Fens. There were larger mills, probably over 200, with sails that measured over 40 to 42 feet long. The examples in these photographs were all fitted with common sails, that is, they required a canvas cover to operate, and they all ran scoop wheels. The sails were usually turned to the wind using a tail pole. Early mills may have been hollow post mills, and there's even some evidence in the fens of Archimedes screws being fitted to mills. Later, brick-built mills and more modern features such as fantails for turning the cap, spring and patent sails were also recorded. But as I say, all of these have now gone, apart from a handful that have been converted into houses. And one of the reasons for this absolute loss of the mills was the successful engineering attempts to drain the fens. There have been several major drainage schemes in the fens over the years. The first date from just before and just after the English Civil War. During this period, this Dutchman, Cornelis Vermuyden, he was appointed to oversee the construction of a drainage system which he completed in 1653. Windmills didn't feature in his scheme. Instead, it relied on gravity and drainage channels. And people still erected windmills, and sometimes they put water into those channels, which overloaded them and caused flooding. And it's been recorded that between 1690 and 1720, over 100 unauthorised drainage mills were ordered to be demolished as a result of that damage. These drainage schemes were so successful that the shrinkage of the peat on the land often left the old drainage mills high and dry above the water levels, so the scoop wheels could no longer reach the water, and the drainage mills in the fens just became entirely redundant. The situation in the Broads is very different. There have been no major engineering schemes in the same scale as in the fens. Water levels were still managed, but this was to prevent grazing pasture from being flooded over winter, which would kill the grass and then the cows would have nothing to eat. Water levels are still managed today, but the mills have been replaced by electric pumps. The last drainage mill stopped working in 1953, and it was this one, and this is Ash Tree Farm Mill near Great Yarmouth, which you can see here before and after it was restored. Marshmen, that's the name for these people, would be employed to run these mills, and they would keep the drainage dikes clear, they would dig them out, and they would look after the cattle that would be grazing during the summer. Many of these types of mills were congregated in one area, the Halvergate Marshes, which includes Ash Tree Farm Drainage Mill, and there are around 30 listed here. However, the remains of 70 drainage mills altogether are known to exist throughout the Broads still, and they represent several different designs, and all are in various states of decay. I say in various states of decay, they range from barely recognisable ruins to fully functioning mills still capable of lifting water, although the latter is very rare. Most mills, even those that are restored, are retained as landscape features, in other words, to look nice, rather than to be functional. Here is one exception, though. This is Polke's Mill, another Halvergate Marshes mill on the River Yare. And this is the same mill after it was restored to full working order. The cap, sails, scoop wheel and drainage channels were all brought back to full working order. Polke's is on an important site. It not only has Polke's Mill, the windmill, it also has a steam engine house, which ran a turbine, a diesel engine shed, which ran pumps. Modern electric pumps are also based here. So the whole history of drainage technology is all congregated on this one site. Unfortunately, very few people get to see it. There's no public road to the site. You can only get to it after a long walk along the flood bank or by boat. Even when you get there, there's no facilities. So these intrepid visitors are on a guided walk. They brought their own lunches, and they've all been warned that there'll be no toilets until they get back home again. And this is where it gets complicated. This is Brograve Mill. It is so characterful and so readily recognisable from the thousands of photographs that are taken of it that if anyone suggested restoring it to full working order, there would be a public outcry. Brograve Mill is also one of the oldest drainage mills left on the Broads. It was built in 1771. Drainage mills arrived in the Broads much later than they did in the fens, perhaps 100 years later. By the later 1700s, when Brograve was built, they were relatively common, though. And there are 8 mills standing that might date from around the 1700s, including Brograve Mill, but most were adapted or changed over time. These early mills did inspire artists, and it would be nice to think that we could rely on their work to tell us something about the detail of these early examples. But sometimes the interpretation of these mills was not as accurate as the depiction of the landscapes that the artist painted. So this is Pettingill's mill, as imagined in a painting by A.E. Davies, with a very unlikely arrangement of stocks. However, at the end of its life, it did have one set of common cells and one pair of patent cells, as is suggested in the painting. And mills like this with brick towers, internal machinery made of wood, and with a cap turned using a tail pull and running a scoop wheel, were probably the most common type at this time. Artists did depict many wooden smock mills. These now have all gone on the Broads, apart from Herringfleet Mill in Suffolk, which was built in about 1820. But they were probably important in the early history of drainage in the Broads. However, as technology improved, many mills were rebuilt or adapted. Brick towers became the norm, and common cells were often replaced with patent cells. And this usually required the towers to be heightened or haned, as is the local expression, to accommodate them, and fantails were usually added to the caps at the same time as this work was being done. Haning involves adding a few courses of brick to the top of the tower to accommodate the cells, and usually in the Broads they did not follow the batter of the tower. So there's a nice example with Thurn Mill here. If you look at the band at the top of the tower, you can see the batter or slope of the mill, and then there's a short straight section which has been haned. And as technology developed further, cast iron components became common, and this mill was also fitted with a centrifugal turbine rather than a scoop wheel. You may see a black canister at the base of that mill that houses the turbine. Today, when drainage mills are being restored, it's usually only the tower, the cap, and sometimes the sails and fantail that have work done. It's very rare to restore the scoop wheels or turbines. There's no need, because water levels on the marshes are now controlled by electric pumps, and in any case, often the old mills would pump water in the wrong direction. Water is often pumped back onto some of the marshes nowadays to support wildlife and keep the marshes damp. But what's the current state of drainage mill heritage in the Broads? Well, every now and again, someone undertakes a major survey of the Broads and usually says something about what they think about the current state. But each of these surveys is just a snapshot in time. And as we've already seen, the overall picture is not necessarily one of continual decline. The more optimistic amongst us can point out that some major restoration schemes continue to take place, even if they're not at the pace that some people might like them. This is St Benet's Level Mill being restored in 2022. And this is a newly restored cap being lowered onto the top of Stracy Arms Mill, again in the same year. This mill, when it was built in 1883, was probably the most technologically advanced in the Broads, built from scratch with our cast iron components, patent sails, and a centrifugal turbine. This is Mutton's Mill, another Halvergate Marshes mill in the process of being restored, having 2 pairs of sails attached. And this is the most recent drainage mill to have been restored, Toffmonk's Mill, with pictures from last year. All of these examples you'll note are brick towers, and it's probably this feature that means they're still around today. And they're all largely of Victorian, sometimes of Edwardian construction, so not quite as old as some people might suspect. However, there are some rare survivors made of wood. These 3 trestle mills, sometimes called skeleton mills, are all that remain of perhaps a dozen or more that were erected on the Broads from around 1870. Sometimes they had weatherboarding added to protect the wooden frame, like on the left there, St Olave's Mill. Essentially, these were just much cheaper versions of the tower mills. As soon as this type of mill became redundant, they deteriorated very, very quickly and were usually lost. And often the only sign that these mills ever existed are the brick piers that are sometimes found on marshland that once supported the wooden structure. This is a picture of one of those mills, a Boardman's Mill, taken in 1934 when it was still working. This mill was constructed in 1897, so it had only been working for 37 years by this point. And this is the mill again, just 16 years later, drawn in 1950. It looks just as dilapidated in 1958 in this photograph. and again in 1969. It was restored in the 1970s. This is how it looked when I was first introduced to it in July 2021. In September 2022, its sails were taken down because they were becoming a hazard for people who were walking along the footpath below it. And so some of these mills, it's worth noting, have been ruinous for far, far longer than they ever worked. An even rarer survivor is the hollow post mill. And that's what you're looking at here. This is clay rack mill. There's not many of us that can say we're in better condition now than we were 45 years ago, but clay rack mill can, even in this state. This is how it was found in 1981 when it was discovered at Ranworth. It was disused, disintegrating, and the landowners didn't want it. In fact, they didn't know it was there. It was relocated, it was restored by the millwright Richard Seago, erected on the clay rack marshes at How Hill, and so has now become known as a clay rack mill. And this was the result of the restoration, a hollow post mill with 4 anti-clockwise turning patent sails and an 8-bladed fantail, and you can see from the hoodway at the bottom that it ran a scoop wheel. And the caption underneath says that this mill is thought to be the only one of its kind in Britain, and that's very probably true. Each year, Historic England publishes the Heritage at Risk Register, and currently 3 Broads mills are included on the list. And they do include Boardman's, which we've met, Herringfleet Marsh Mill, which I've mentioned, and also Turf Fen Wind Pump, which is also at How Hill, same place as Boardman's Mill. It's not always, so sometimes when these risk registers are published, it causes alarm. One of the good things it does is it releases funding or makes funding available that previously isn't, so it's not always a bad thing. And that's the case for Turf Fen Mill, because this is Turf Fen Mill this year undergoing a major restoration. It is an important mill. It ran 2 scoop wheels. It had double gearing. But again, it's only the tower, the cap, and the sails that are going to be restored on this mill to be preserved as a landscape feature. And hopefully, it will regain its place on the cover for the Ordnance Survey map of the Broads. Currently, it's been displaced by Thurn Mill, but I'm not going to show that picture. Makes me upset. I would say that the main threats to the remaining examples of the UK's drainage mill heritage are threefold: lack of knowledge, lack of skills, lack of money. I would add a fourth, apathy, but I think that's a product of the first 3. In the UK, most people associate mills with flour production, and most people who visit the Broads come to enjoy boating. And often they don't appreciate that the mills they are seeing were built for an entirely different reason. The mills themselves are often only found beside waterways or in the middle of remote marshes, where even people who live in Norfolk won't see them that often. And many are very inaccessible. It's very difficult to find opportunities or volunteers to run and maintain them. And there are very few people with the millwrighting skills required to restore them sympathetically as well. And restoring these mills have added complications, especially when they're in environmentally sensitive areas like grazing marshes. It makes the task very difficult and extremely expensive. And aside from a few individuals with very deep pockets who own their own mills, the future Broads drainage mills, the last in the UK, really vested with these institutions. And they have all sorts of other priorities as well. And it's really up to us mill enthusiasts to make it clear to them whenever we can that people care about these machines and believe that time, effort, and money should be spent on protecting them. Thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed for a really insightful both introduction but very honest appraisal of the reality of our drainage heritage here in the UK. Andrew, you're with us, and be very grateful now if you'd care to answer any questions that are coming up from our audience here. So questions, please, for Andrew. Do we have any questions? Absorbing.
I couldn't work out how to put my hand up at all, so people might just want to shout out.
You're welcome to do that. Thanks, Andrew.
I can see a question said why would there be a public outcry if the restored Brograve Mill, which is the ruined one I saw in the marshes? And I think it's just because it is so familiar to people. And not only that, it's in very close proximity to one that is actually open to the public, and a lot of money gets spent on it anyway, which is Horsey Mill, which is owned by the National Trust. I may have overstated it by saying that there'd be an absolute outcry, but it's such a familiar feature. I think at the most what they would do is maintain it in its current appearance. You know, the chance of putting a cap on Brograve Mill is slim to naught.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. So- oh, I can. Amana's just saying a thumbs up there. Anybody else got any questions? Well, I'm curious,
Andrew,
Andrew. Oh, was that somebody wanting
sorry,
to come in? Alyssa,
y-
come on in.
sorry, Andrew, you mentioned just briefly the Horsey mill. Could
Yeah.
you say a bit more about Horsey? It's quite significant, I believe.
It's significant in that it is owned by the National Trust, which is our big charity that looks after mainly large houses and estates and things like that. But it does own a couple of mills. So it also owns Wicken Drainage Mill, I talked about in the Fens as well. And because of that reason, it has facilities. So there's tea rooms, there is a car park, there are toilets that make it quite easy for people to get to, and it's right on a roadside as well. So for that reason, it's significant. Is it significant for any other reason that it's easy to get to? I guess the National Trust might say it is, but it's just like any other drainage mill, really. It's relatively recently built, even it's not very old, really. One of the more modern mills, but it has been restored. You can go into it. So for most people who come to Norfolk and will see a drainage mill, it will probably be that one or Thurn, which is another one that's open regularly. So it's significant for that reason that people get to see it. If people get to see them, they learn about them and maybe they learn to love them.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Thank you, Alyssa, for the question. I'm curious, Andrew, about the way in which materials have influenced the design. I also was noticing very much that there were some very Dutch characteristics that were clearly working their way into the design of some of the smock drainage mills. I'm very familiar with one close to my mill in Cambridgeshire, which sadly is no longer there. Which, if you look at it, a picture of it, or indeed a drawing of it, you could easily imagine that it would be in a polder in the Netherlands. So, anything you'd like to say about the way in which Dutch design not only influenced the drainage in terms of the geology, but actually equally perhaps we were able to draw some influences in terms of the design and construction of the mills.
Yeah, I was struck by how some of the pictures we were seeing of current Dutch mills look like the ones from a few hundred years ago that I was showing that were on the fence aren't there anymore. So there is evidence that with the Dutch millwrights were involved in construction of mills in the fens. I think there's less evidence of that happening in the Broads. In fact, there's evidence of millwrights from Norfolk going across to the fens. Latterly, Thomas Smithdale's vehicle, I know, travelled all the way across to the fens. Might not seem on the Grand World stage that big a distance, but to us that live in Norfolk, going to the fens is a long way away. So there's evidence of Dutch in the fens. That influence, I think, is a lot less in the Broads. And there are certain styles of when you're in the Broads, you will see things like patent sails, which are very common. You will see fantails on the mills, which are very common, which aren't, as I understand it, very common features on the Dutch mills, for example. And we even have very regional things like Norfolk shaped, boat shaped caps, Norfolk cap for a mill. So it's very, very local, or is meant to be a very local feature or characteristic of this area that you wouldn't see elsewhere. Probably because we're on the coast and we had boat builders. They were used to using wood, and they put boats on anything. I guess that's that's the influence. Turn it upside down and you have a cap.
Interesting, isn't it? And actually, I would just say, the mill that I am a custodian of, the design of the windshaft arrangement was one which was very common with drainage mills in the fens. And in fact, people used to say that from my mill, which is just on the edge of the fens, you could see 40 mills, which were a mixture of corn mills and drainage mills on the fens in the 19th century. So I think equally a way in which the technology used for both pumping mills influenced corn mills and the other way round in this part on the fens. Well, any final questions for uh, Andrew before we continue on our journey? And
Um,
Bill, would like
uh,
to come in.
um, I hope this isn't a silly question. It's been bothering me for a long time. Cast iron wind shaft must weigh 2 or 3 tons. How on earth did they get it onto the top of a brick tower, particularly out in the middle of the fens or the broads with poor access? Any ideas, please?
Well, Bill, you could have emailed me this privately and let me know. Um, Bill, I have to say, is being a volunteer at one of our other mills, one of our corn mills in North. I say one of ours. I'm not working for the Windmills Trust anymore, but I don't know, Bill. I'd like to know. Stracy Arms is the one I mentioned that had the cast iron wind shaft, and when we brought the stocks and the sails back to the site when we were restoring it, we couldn't even bring those in by road. So we brought them in by boat. So, and I would guess that that is also what happened. That they were transporting them by water. Exactly how they lifted them up, props and that, I really couldn't say. Because once they're in situ, they generally last forever, and you restore everything that's around them. So I've never seen anyone put one in, but yeah, they generally come in sections as well. So the one at Stracy it comes, I think, in 3 sections. So it's not the full length all at once. But if they didn't bring them by water, I'd be very surprised.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I don't know if there's anybody else in our audience who has some experience of how stocks were raised in mills. This is a common challenge across milling. John Boucher, I wondered if John might be willing to come in. John, would you like just to you take yourself off mute, John, if you'd be so kind, first of all, please? Otherwise, we won't hear you. Let's just see if we can unmute you, John.
So,
There we go.
is that
Yes,
better?
please. Yes, we can hear you now.
A very common way of doing it was to use a gin pole, which is like a giant telegraph pole, stick it up by the side of the mill, put a block and tackle on the top end, and you can pull it up. And I've got photographs of that being done fairly recently at a mill in Spain, actually.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, John. There we go. We have some insight, Bill. I hope that question that's been
Another
troubling you.
point perhaps I could just mention, I noticed 1 or 2 of the towers didn't have caps on. So presumably if there's any machinery inside, it's getting damaged. And the same applies to corn mills. Now, Heege Windmill have an excellent temporary roof, a canvas roof, which they used in the recent reconstruction, which is now surplus to requirement, and they're desperate to get rid of it. So if anybody would like a temporary canvas roof for the mill, let me know. Take a tower up to 6 meter diameter.
Thank you very much, John. So there you go. There's an offer there. If I guess if you're probably slightly more UK centric, although we're amazing what we can ship into different countries. We've got a cap roof available there. Thank you very much indeed, John. Thank you once again to Andrew. So, after hearing and seeing how the technology is cross-fertilized across the North Sea, we're now going to need to either get a bit of a longer boat journey or perhaps hop on a plane because we're going stateside. And delighted to be welcoming Lindsay Baker and Christopher Gillis to join us today. So, Dr. Baker is a leading authority on the history of the American windmill industry, having spent more than 50 years writing scholarly books, as well as numerous papers, articles on the topic. Christopher has been the editor and publisher of the Windmills Gazette for, I think, over 10 years, and also has a significant history of writing on our subject. So it's great to welcome them both. And We'll first of all hear from them, and then again, we'll have an opportunity for some questions. So let's hear their presentation. Thank you.
Well, good day. My name is Christopher Gillis, and I am editor and publisher of the Windmillers Gazette. And I am here today with Dr. T. Lindsay Baker, founder and editor emeritus of the Windmillers Gazette. And we're here today to present to our listeners on the topic of wind machines pumping water in North America. Dr. Baker, please proceed.
Well, let me begin by saying how pleased that I am to be able to participate in this event and to talk about how people have used the wind to do human work. Humans have used large numbers of wind machines to pump water in 3 vast regions of the world: the Pampas of Argentina and Uruguay, the continent of Australia, and the western half of the continent of North America. This last region encompasses Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Their western areas generally lack sufficient surface water for many human activities, and all 3 depend upon groundwater to make up the difference. For decades, the wind provided the energy to elevate this vital resource from beneath the ground surface. In North America, the concept of using the wind to do human work originated from Europe. Immigrants brought that technology from the Old World, whether it was English-style windmills on the Atlantic coast or Russian timber-built windmills on the other side of the continent in California. All these early mills required human attention to operate, and most of them ground grain. As Euro-Americans moved westward across North America, whether to Saskatchewan in Canada, to Nebraska in the USA, or to Sonora in Mexico, they entered lands that could be rich in some resources, but poor in others. Often they found little water. Streams and rivers, often few in number, could not sate the thirst of either people or their animals, even though they might unknowingly live atop subterranean aquifers. A Yankee mechanic in New England near the Atlantic coast came up with a solution. Daniel Halliday, born in 1826 in Vermont, had represented an American steam engine maker at the 1851 Crystal Palace Exposition in London. He was no country bumpkin. An associate in Coventry, Connecticut, suggested that there would be a market for small wind machines that could govern their own speed without constant human attention. All the windmills then on the Atlantic coast required people to regulate their speed and to operate their moving parts. It is likely that Halliday had observed wooden-bladed, shop-made wind pumps that elevated seawater into shallow oceanside evaporation ponds for salt making along the nearby coast. Their simplicity may have inspired him to consider making similar rudimentary wind machines that could take care of themselves. Whatever his inspiration, Daniel Halliday in 1854 developed the concept of a paddle-bladed wind machine that on its own governed its speed and operation. One of the major concerns was to prevent the blades from spinning so rapidly that they tore to pieces from centrifugal force. Halliday addressed this concern by placing centrifugal weights on his paddles. These weights drew the pivoting blades back to more oblique angles, reducing the surface area exposed to the wind and thereby regulating the speed of rotation. A rigidly attached vane automatically directed the machine into the wind whenever its direction changed. By combining these two principles, Daniel Halliday successfully developed a self-governing wind engine. It was the first ever to achieve commercial success. The inventor founded a company in Connecticut to produce his wind machines, which farmers and others purchased to elevate water and to grind feed for livestock. But sales were not what he had hoped. Then in 1863, with the assistance of investors, he moved the factory just under 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, to Batavia, Illinois. This was near Chicago and had convenient railway access. But more importantly, it lay at the eastern edge of the vast treeless Great Plains that stretched westward 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, to the Rocky Mountains. This broad, open grassland was even longer north to south, stretching 1,800 miles, 2,900 kilometers, from Texas to the Canadian prairies. The whole area was just then filling with Euro-American settlers. Consequently, this western area in North America became a gigantic market for groundwater pumping wind machines. The western two-thirds of North America generally lacked sufficient water in rivers and streams to support intensive human occupation. People who settled near enough to these sources to haul it back to their homes, farms, and ranches in wagons could live on the land, but they could only concentrate close to stream courses. The self-governing wind pump, developed first by Daniel Halliday, helped resolve this limitation. If farmers or ranchers could afford the cost for a driller to sink a well and to purchase a windmill, they could live virtually anywhere that they chose. The price, however, was not cheap. An ordinary 12-foot diameter wind engine on the Texas plains in the 1880s cost $130. Today, $5,200, plus shipment and expense of erecting a tower. At the same time, drilled wells in the same region cost $1 a foot. Today, the equivalent would be $40 a foot for the first 100 feet, $1.50 a foot for the next 100 feet, and then 50 cents a foot in addition until water was struck. Despite the expense, wells and wind pumps together did enable Euro-Americans to occupy the land surface more or less evenly rather than just along stream courses. The economic and social impacts cannot be exaggerated. Makers of farm implements in Canada drew their inspiration in wind engine design from both the United States and England. The country soon had its own indigenous industry, making the machines and their accoutrements. Canadian manufacturers recognized that the prairies represented a substantial market for their goods, and they prospered manufacturing windmills and pumps for decades. The Yankee concept of using wind pumps to raise water likewise transferred to Mexico, though it required a quarter century for it fully to take root. Mexican citizens made up for the delay with their enthusiasm for using the wind to draw the water. In time, thousands of wind machines, made both in the United States and at home in Mexico, appeared all over the arid and semi-arid northern and western Mexico. To this day, multiple companies there produce and export self-governing windmills to overseas markets. The conditions that made American-style wind engines integral to economic developments in North America were mirrored in other places around the world where they remain important. The pampas of Argentina and Uruguay, broad treeless prairies rich in pasturage, became cattle-raising country, famous for its gaucho horsemen. Ranchers there soon began importing wind pumps from both the United States and Europe. As might be expected, this led to the development of South American-based factories, which thrived. Currently, the largest manufacturer and exporter of water-pumping wind machines in the entire world is Fábrica de Implementos Agrícolas Sociedad Anónima outside Buenos Aires. Rural Australia became the third place on the globe to employ truly huge numbers of wind pumps. Like Western North America and the Pampas, it has huge land areas bereft of surface water, but abounding with groundwater. As in South America, farmers there first imported self-governing wind engines from Europe and the United States. But the country developed its own large wind pump manufacturing industry that produced the machines by the tens of thousands. Without these devices and the drilled wells to access underground aquifers, economic development in Australia would have taken wholly different courses. Drilled wells and wind engines to pump water impacted more people than just rural dwellers. One of their significant contributions was to the operation of steam railways that bound together entire nations around the world. Locomotives required water in their boilers to create the necessary steam, but that water needed to be both physically clean and free from minerals like calcium carbonate that could clog their boiler tubes. During the early years of railroading, locomotives stopped frequently for water, but by the middle of the 19th century, after they began pulling tenders carrying both water and fuel, the intervals grew to every 100 miles, every 160 kilometers, depending upon track grades and the weights of cargoes. In areas with limited surface water, or where pipelines were not feasible, windmills pumped groundwater into overhead reservoirs from which locomotives received their supply. The wind machines typically ran until they filled the large tanks, when automatic cutoff mechanisms shut them off. In the United States, most of these reservoirs held 50,000 gallons, about 190,000 liters. Often, it was convenient for railway firms to erect these reservoirs and wind pumps at shop and repair yards, where the tanks provided gravity flow water supply for maintenance operations. The large elevated tanks and windmills became commonplace features of the landscape in many areas where groundwater provided the only source of supply. Although urban areas seem unlikely places for wind pumps, many communities relied on them to pump their entire water supplies. In some locales, large diameter windmills elevated water for municipal water systems. In some cities, cylindrical reservoirs were placed atop multi-story commercial and tenement buildings to provide water under gravity pressure for fire protections, with windmills elevating that supply from wells underground. Elsewhere in urban areas, individual residence owners, depending upon their personal wells for supply, use the wind to elevate water into private storage tanks. In some affluent areas, owners of estates or mansions mounted windmills on decorative towers that sometimes also supported raised reservoirs. European-style windmills had introduced the concept of using the wind to serve human needs. Although newer technologies assumed their earlier roles, in the 20th century, romantic notions of the past sometimes brought the old world windmills back to work. In a representative case, the city of San Francisco, California, in 1902, erected a 75-foot, 23-meter Dutch windmill to pump irrigation water in Golden Gate Park. The experiment was so popular with residents that they themselves raised funds to erect a second windmill 5 feet, 1.5 meters taller than the first. For years they did yeoman service, their water converting a sand dune-covered wasteland into a now verdant public space. In time, electric pumps supplanted the windmills, which deteriorated only to be reborn through intermittent preservation efforts that began as early as 1974. By elevating groundwater in areas that did not have flowing surface water, wind engines enabled large numbers of people to live in arid and semi-arid regions around the world. The majority of these machines adapted the concept of self-governing operation, first devised by Daniel Halliday during the 1850s, though many people in subsequent years improved the machines and increased their efficiency. My colleague, Christopher Gillis, will now discuss how these wind machines pumped water and how over time they were perfected and made more efficient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. For my portion of our presentation, I will explain how one of the most prolific and longest manufactured water pumping windmills, the Aeromotor 702, works. An aeromotor, like most traditional all-metal water pumping windmills, consists of three main parts: the windmill, including wind wheel, hub and shaft, mainframe, gearing, and vane assembly, a tower, and the water pumping assembly, which includes the drop pipes, sucker rods, and cylinder. Wheels on aeromotor windmills, no matter the age or size, consist of 18 contoured trapezoidal sheet metal blades held in place by special metal clips attached to two concentric steel rings and secured together by steel spokes that are attached to the hub. The wind wheel starts turning when a sufficient wind of 8 to 10 miles per hour or 13 to 16 kilometers per hour strikes the curved blade slightly off center. Keeping the slightly off center wheel facing the wind is a V-shaped sheet metal tail vane attached to the back of the mainframe of the mill by a hinged steel tailbone and vane spring. The mainframe, which supports the wheel sections and tail, swivels on a mast pipe. When the wind becomes too great, for example, reaching above 20 miles per hour or 32 kilometers per hour, the force of the wind starts to furl the mill, turning it on the mast pipe so both the tail and wheel are parallel to the direction of the wind. The tension of the vane spring increases as the mill is furled and returns the mill to face the wind as the velocity decreases. The windmill can also be taken out of service by using a manual furling device or mechanical regulator. To access the wind, windmills are erected on tops of wood or metal towers. All metal aeromotor towers are known for their distinctive attributes, namely their loop steps, which are connected to a single corner post or leg of the four-post tower. The towers are secured to anchor posts set into holes in the ground of an average 4 feet deep or just over a meter deep. Aeromotor towers range in height between 21 feet or 47 feet, or 66.5 meters or 14 meters, although taller towers are used. For the best access to the wind, the tower needs to be at least 15 feet or 4.5 meters taller than any nearby wind obstruction, such as buildings and trees within a radius of approximately 400 feet or 120 meters. Near the top of the tower and just below the wind wheel is either a wooden or metal platform on which a person can stand to perform maintenance and oil changes. The wind wheel, when in motion, drives the hub and shaft, which are connected and housed within the cast iron mainframe. Inside the gearbox is the shaft, with two small pinion gears attached and evenly spaced by a Babbitt bearing. These small gears mesh with two larger gears, which drive two pitman arms that are held together at their opposite ends by a short shaft with a roller guide supporting yoke. As the gears drive the pitman arms, they transfer their rotational motion to reciprocating action needed to operate the pump rod. The up and down motion of the pitman arms is kept in place by a looped steel pitman guide, to which is also bolted the protective sheet metal helmet of the windmill. A metal ring supported by the pump rod yoke picks up oil from one of the larger gears on the downstroke of the pump rod and carries it to the cross shaft, keeping all the upper parts lubricated. Attached to the yoke, the pump rod is suspended through the center of the mast pipe. Inside the tower, it attaches to a swivel, where it connects to a series of narrow rods. Wood is recommended, which in turn are bolted end to end and attached to a series of metal sucker rods starting at ground level. The bolted together string of sucker rods is lowered inside a steel drop pipe which lines the well. The bottom sucker rod screws onto the plunger on a brass pump cylinder. These pump cylinders consist of an internal steel rod, one check valve, and one plunger valve. The check valve screws onto the bottom of the cylinder, and above is a plunger valve that is attached to the sucker rod. Water flows into the cylinder through the check valve during the upstroke of the plunger valve, and then on the downstroke, the check valve closes, pushing the water through the plunger valve and into the drop pipe. The plunger valve then closes on the upstroke, pushing the water higher while refilling the cylinder through the check valve. As a general rule, when calculating the length of a cylinder to use, the length of the pump stroke should be equal to or greater than in inches to the diameter of the air motor windwheel in feet. For example, an 8-foot or 2.5 meter mill's stroke equates to approximately 8 inches or 20 centimeters. With the air motor vane spring at maximum tension, the typical 8-foot or 2.5 meter windmill, when running at full speed, makes about 32 strokes of the pump per minute. With each stroke, water fills the drop pipe until it reaches the surface and discharges into a tank or pond via a raised splash pipe. If the water is destined for an overhead tank, then a stuffing box is used to force the water higher until it discharges into the holding tank for irrigation or watering livestock. The key to an American water pumping windmill's longevity of service, and there are cases in which some windmills have pumped water continuously for 60 to 70 years, is routine maintenance. Once a year, the oil in the gearbox should be changed, and any loosened nuts and bolts of the windmill and tower should be tightened. Occasionally, the pump cylinder must be pulled to the surface for inspection and to replace the worn leather washers of the plunger valve. Dr. Baker and I would like to thank the attendees for their time and consideration with regards to our presentation, Wind Machines Pumping Water in North America. We hope you find this list of pertinent resources on the history of the American water pumping windmill of interest. Thanks again.
Thank you very much indeed to Christopher and to Lindsay. Now, I understand that you guys are due to be with us. I was just trying to check in to see if you have been able to join us. If you are there, could you say hello, please? There we go, Christopher. Welcome. I can see you now. Great stuff. Thank you very much. And thank you so much for a really, as I say, fascinating insight. And I'm just noticing already that just as in the Netherlands, where drainage mills enabled large areas of land to be able to be used by humans, then of course that's exactly the same thing as you just described took place in the US. And you've also helped us understand how that same technology had, by the sounds of it, a very similar impact in South America, in South Africa, and in Australasia areas as well. So incredible, isn't it, how the availability of pumping and wind power has done this across the old world and very much the new world. But let's see if we have some questions, please, for Christopher and Lindsay. Any questions? Well, if I may, then I'd ask, what are you finding? You've explained that these pumping engines can have a lifespan of, 60, 80 years. How many are still doing good service? And in which particular areas of the States do you find these machines still playing an important role?
Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely, Chris. Yeah, you're
Okay.
coming
Yeah, sure.
over just fine.
Well, it's interesting where you can find some of these early windmills, especially of the Model 702 variety, are in operation in a lot of Amish communities, actually in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, up into Michigan. And I mean, and they rely on them to pump their water. And again, they just take meticulous care of them. The Another location I would say, and maybe T. Lindsay could add to this, but we would see this also in the panhandle of Texas on active cattle ranches and in also New Mexico.
Thank you. I can see that there's some comments in the chat, so I'm just going to pick those up. First of all, James Tasker, I think his microphone's not working. He says some 50 years ago, James visited Wyoming, where his host had many wind pumps on his ranch for cattle troughs in very remote locations. He'd visit these periodically to check them. Has the type of water pumping in very remote locations been replaced by any other technology, such as PV? So I think photovoltaic.
Absolutely. We are starting to see that a lot more. I think some of the what we call professional windmillers, they're the folks that sort of replace the cowboys over the years of go out and tend to the ranch windmills, are actually taking more of them down these days and replacing them with photovoltaic pumps. So that's kind of a sad thing to see go, but a lot of ranchers just simply do not want to climb the towers. They don't want the liability of people climbing towers on their property. And so, with a solar pump, it's low profile to the ground. So it's no more tower, right? So, and the technology's gotten better. So, you don't have all that mechanical maintenance if you do up on the tower. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Chris. I can see Anthony Constable, you've got a question there. Would you like me to read the question out, or would you be willing to come on and ask it yourself?
Yeah, you can go ahead and read it. Thank you.
No problem, Anthony. Thank you. So, Anthony, you're asking, how did the capability evolve over time to be able to calculate the blade design and sizing required to meet the power requirements of a particular mill based on its available wind speeds and wind potential energy? Was that a job for the millwright? That's Anthony's question.
T. Lindsay, would you like to take a shot at that one? You're on mute.
You're on mute. There you go.
Thank
Great.
you very much. Is there much undertaken
I'm afraid, T. Lindsay, your sound is not good. We're not actually able to hear what you're saying. Not sure if there's anything you can do to your connection, but Unfortunately, we're
Okay.
still struggling there. Chris, I don't know whether you're able
I'll take a
to
shot
step in
at
and
it.
help out. I'm sorry
Uh,
about
well,
that, T. Lindsay.
well, T. Lindsay knows a deeper history of this than myself. The, as a lot of it was just mere experimentation that evolved over time. Sometimes they would experiment on very tall towers at their factories. Later on, in the early 20th century, we saw more perfection of the wind wheel with the introduction of wind tunnel technology. Again, oftentimes located in these factories, these companies really like to guard their so-called trade secrets, right? So they would do a lot of that. So yeah, it was a process of evolving over time. And again, it then by let's say by the 1930s, the industry was changing, and I think the experimentation was these companies were going more into survival mode than as electrification was coming on board for pumping water, and so yeah, it was again we had this like observation to wind tunnel. So hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. John, you would like to come in as well.
Yeah. Could I make a comment?
Please do.
I have a Wakes and Lamb wind engine in my back garden, which really is there decoratively, but it will pump if I connect the pump. But normally I just freewheel it. Now, I'm interested really because it has a vane to um, turn it into the wind. Bigger engines and windmills often have fans, um, which seem to be more efficient on the whole. One of the things I've noticed that when it gets tailwinded in a light or moderate wind, it doesn't respond very quickly. It seems that the drag on the wind wheel at the front pulls it into line before the vane takes effect. It doesn't seem a very efficient system, that. So I'm just wondering if it wouldn't have been better to have wind wheels, fantails on all these little wind engines.
Right, that is an interesting observation. I hope we have Dr. Baker. I don't know if your mic is working.
And still, I'm very sorry, Dr. Baker. The sound is very dislocated. Chris, maybe you could just keep going. I'm sorry about that.
I'll give it a shot. And Dr. Baker, he can maybe correct me later if I misspeak on this. But the problem with if you did have a guide wheel on the back of these windmills, it would make them more complicated, more expensive. I mean, the whole concept about it's important to American windmills is that their simplicity as much as possible. It keeps them inexpensive, but also it allows the average farmer to climb up there and work on it. And again, if you add complexity, it's just going to frustrate them. And sometimes they'll just take the inefficiency with the windmill. But I really appreciate your observation there, sir. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Chris. Agnes, I can see you have your hand up there. Would you like to come in, please?
Yes, I would. I'm Agnes de Boer from the Hollandse Molen. And we are talking in the Netherlands. We have a system of water boards. The whole country is covered with that boards, and we are talking with them about using the water mills in pumping water out, especially because of the climate change. But there are a lot of water boards who are afraid of making appointments with the millers because they're not professionals on this team, and yeah, can you trust them in using the mill in the good purpose? How are the experiences in other countries with that?
So I think understanding you, Agnes, there that the water boards are there to manage water levels,
Yes.
and we are pumping water.
Yeah.
And so, how is this being dealt with in other countries? Well, we could
Yeah.
open that question out, to anybody who's on our conference call. I mean, maybe we could start with Chris. Is there anything you can offer here? Is
Yeah, it's something pretty exceptional to Northern Europe. We we really don't have anything experience such as that for most of the United States, and I imagine the same with Canada and Mexico. But yeah, that's definitely a question that would be nice to open up to the broader audience here. John, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Anybody else like to come in on this? As I say, we have a number of countries represented on our conference today. Anybody like to offer any thoughts? I'm just scanning our screens here.
I could say a little bit about the Broads, John, which is
Please do.
basically that we've got so few mills that are able to pump water. It's not a huge consideration, but I did mention in my presentation that some of our mills would pump water in what would be considered to be the wrong direction now. So we've got lots of areas where the drainage was so successful, the wildlife that likes to live on the grazing marshes, for example, would be threatened if they weren't re-wetted. Um, so Stracy Arms Mill, which I showed in my presentation, actually sits right next to most of the mills have been replaced with an electric pump that sits right next to an existing drainage
Yeah.
mill. And it has an automatic pump when it's the electric pump that decides when to run. If we had restored Stracy Arms to full working order, every time we switched that mill on, the electric pump would have sent the water back where it had come from. But there are so few drainage mills in the UK that can actually pump. It really wouldn't make any much difference to the drainage system. We have something called the Internal Drainage Board that is responsible for maintaining water levels, but our mills make very, very little difference to. They're only run for demonstration purposes in the UK.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. I think this is a very important topic. Later this year, we will have a conference exploring the watermill, what we call the watermill biotope, the impact of the environment and the influence of water, not only to use as a source of power, but also in terms of what we may say called biodiversity and the influence of all these different factors. And I know certainly in the UK, but across Europe, there are very different pressures on our rivers and on users of water. In the UK, you have to have a license to take water to drive your watermill. That's
Okay.
kind of interesting. Even though you're putting the water back, you still have to have a license, and our Environment Agency will be delighted if you pay to take the water. So, these are very different pressures, and I think, Andrew, you've highlighted that water is being used to both irrigate, it is being used for transport, it is being used to move water for drinking eventually into different areas for leisure, for tourism, and we are much more aware of the environmental implications of drawing water and moving it in different areas. But we are very much aware that our Dutch colleagues have been dealing with these issues for much longer than many of us have. So yeah, it's a fascinating area, isn't it? Well, we are really reaching the point where we would normally now draw our conference to a conclusion. So, are there any final questions? Well, thank you, everyone. I will just say I want to first of all thank Elisa Crawford, one of our steering group members, for her work in facilitating and inviting Chris and Dr. Baker to join us today. I'm also going to recognise that you guys are getting up pretty early to join us for our conference, and a few other colleagues, by the looks of it, from the US as well. So it's great to be broadening our audience and really, fulfilling our remit of the craft of the miller across the globe. I will also notice, if you've been following the chat, that Yippe also offered us a picture of a wind shaft being installed at an oil mill. So if you haven't seen that, then please take a look at the chat and you can see that, which is fascinating, which follows on from our question. So we're now drawing to a conclusion for today. I would like, on your behalf, to thank all our speakers for fascinating presentations. Very grateful for the time that they've put in to prepare those presentations. To thank Jippe for doing the technology behind the scenes, and to thank you all for joining our conference. We are always keen for feedback. Over the next few months, you will see information about our new website, which will also offer some additional features to enable you to connect more easily with colleagues, fellow millers in different countries. And there'll be some other very exciting innovations coming over the next few months. So watch out for those things. Do let us know if there are topics that you would like us to cover, because we're here to further the craft of the miller and to promote it. And that's what we are trying to do. But your feedback is really helpful. So thank you, everyone, once again. Very grateful, and wish you a good end to your days. Thank you. Bye-bye.